These generally grow about at least this Lee here, which is the most popular Jujube. The fruit is green until you can see these little tiny ones forming right now. They're about smaller than a pea, but they'll develop into something on a mature tree about the size of a chicken egg. And generally inside, there's one seed in the middle. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. The overall flavor of Jujube is definitely apple, but about twice as sweet. So very, very sweet. In Asia right now, they often dry them. To me, dried, they're like dried apples. They're not my favorite fruit, but fresh, they are crispy but very tender. And again, quite sweet, up to 30% sugar. So real, very, very sweet. They're often used to flavor foods. Most of these ripen in the fall, either late at the very end of summer to about mid-fall is the ripening period. And the unique thing about these is that they bear on new growth. So Jujubes is one tree that you don't have to watch what you're doing when you're pruning them. If you just make them smaller, they'll come up next year and flower and fruit no matter what. So an article we read a long time ago was stating that in Afghanistan, some of the poor farmers, this is a subsist, or what do you call it, one of their main things that they get everything from. So they said each tree will make about 20 pounds of fruit during late summer, early fall. They'll sell that, and then within 2 weeks they strip off all the leaves and feed them to their cattle. And then in the winter time, they'll cut the tree down to about 3 or 4 feet and use it for firewood. And the next year the tree will do everything over again. So after I read that, I had a Jujube in my yard that was about 8 foot tall. We cut it down to 18 inches just to see what would happen. And by next July, it was back up over my head, full of flowers and fruit again. So they don't need any wood to grow fruit off of. They can be cut severely. Now these are grafted trees, so you can't cut them too low. So this tree, and it is one of the harder trees to graft apparently, because most fruit trees, what they do is a bud graft. They'll just take a single bud off of a branch of a tree and graft it onto the rootstock where they want to do. This plant, they're actually doing a stem graft. So the graft on this plant is right here, but it's this piece. They actually had to graft on a piece of stem to make it work. Just a bud doesn't seem to make it. They have to graft on a whole stem. So Jujube is one of the harder plants to propagate for that reason. They cost quite a bit more than regular fruit trees because they don't get enough wood to graft with. Since one bud doesn't work, they have, this is basically 3 or 4 buds worth of wood here. So it takes them a lot more effort to create these. So they have always been expensive. They are, like most of all these fruit trees, deciduous. So they drop their leaves usually within 2 or 3 weeks after the fruit's off. The leaves are turning yellow and falling off, so they go to sleep quite early, and they do wake up with warm weather. So they don't need a chill apparently, because in our observations the last 20 years, the cooler the spring, the later they wake up. The warmer the winter, the earlier they wake up. It seems like they don't need the winter; they're just waiting for it to get warm. So during the like 2014, winter of 2014, it was like 90 degrees in January. They woke up in January. But in 2008, we didn't hit 80 degrees till late June. They didn't wake up till June that year. So when it gets warm, they wake up and start growing and they start fruiting. Now they are quite drought tolerant, but if you want a good crop, we'd rather do average to ample water, just like any other fruit tree. They are one of the prettier trees. They do have this nice, you can see on the branches here, kind of a zigzag style of growth. So they generally grow upwards and then outwards and then kind of hang down, and the branches zigzag as they go along. The young branches are spiny, for their protection. So that you have to be careful with when they're young. When I first planted my first one, I cut off all the thorns on the trunk because my kids were young then, so they wouldn't get hurt by that. As they get older, they make fewer and fewer thorns. Old trees seem to be fairly thornless. Now, as far as pollination goes, they are partially self-fertile. So most textbooks have written, the older textbooks have written that you just need one tree. In orchards, pretty much you just need one cultivar, one genetic variety like Lee here. But by themselves, they don't pollinate that well. So the first tree I took home all by itself, kept it nice and clean, and it produced maybe 10 fruit a year. I'm going, okay, the ones at the store are producing 50 a year, and mine is bigger and it's only producing 10. It must need a pollinator. Well, what's going on is in an orchard, they don't keep the orchards that clear of the suckers. So the one thing about Jujubes is that they do make suckers, but suckers are, whoops, I broke the branch, are branches coming off, new branches coming off the root system. So the roots of this tree are genetically a different Jujube. Same species, just a seed-grown Jujube. Usually don't make very good fruit, although I'll eat it. But the suckers come out, and within a few months they're blooming. So this is genetically different than the top of this plant. The flowers on this sucker can pollinate these, and you'll get a better crop, bigger fruit, more fruit. So in an orchard, I would assume they do not go around cutting off all the suckers. If they have thousands and thousands of trees, they'll have some sucker growth, and they'll be blooming, and it'll be pollinating the top. But if you cut all these off, like I did on my first tree, they don't produce much. So it's good. You can either have two different varieties, two different cultivars. Both of these are Lee, so that wouldn't work. You'd have to have something else, like a honey jar or a Chico or a sugar cane, something else to cross with it so it's different pollen, or again, just let at least one sucker grow, and then you should be okay. Okay, so some of the other varieties. Oh, this was Chico. Okay, so the most famous one is Lee. When they brought Lee over, they also brought Lang. I'm not a fan of Lang, so Lee has a fairly large fruit. And then Lang was a skinnier fruit. But Lang, during the cooler, I know we're kind of cool summers here a lot. Not last summer, but a lot of summers we are kind of cool. In fact, we're supposed to have a cool summer this year. And we have a cool summer, Lang's got no flavor. It seems to need a nice warm heat, good heat to ripen properly. Lee seems to ripen better. Chico, which is a new one to us, haven't eaten this one yet. Now, Chico Station, which is a agricultural station up in northern central California near the Sierras, they've done a lot of research on different new varieties of Jujubes, and Chico is one of theirs. And instead of being a long fruit, it's more of at least the pictures show more of a flat apple-shaped fruit. Honey jar has been the sweetest, but it's also the smallest. And a lot of fruit is that way. A lot of the fruits that are really tiny just pack more punch in that little fruit. So honey jar, which is not much bigger than a marble, seems to be the sweetest. I'm out of sugar cane this year. Sugar cane, another real sweet one, shaped more like this. And earlier we had G8, 66, we're out of those now. That was another one released by Chico State. And it was a decent sized fruit that was really sweet also. That was a little bigger than Lang, not as big as Lee. The last one we have out there is one of the newest ones also. It's called Shanxi Lee. and it's supposed to be the biggest one of the group. They're claiming 50% larger in lead, but we have not seen, we've seen the fruit on them in a container like this, but it was about the same size as regularly. Probably in the ground a few years it'll reach the biggest size possible, the Shanxi Li. Here's the picture they're giving us of Shanxi Li. The confusion would be is that Li is from China in a province I believe called Shanxi, and then they come out with one called Shanxi Li. It's like that's the same name. So we'll see if it actually is a bigger fruit. We've got I think about 5 or so trees in our stock right now of Shanxi Li, and regularly. I mean, even though the small ones are generally sweeter, to me I like the size. I like the bigger ones. Get more to eat. Any questions on Jujubes? So the one problem that's potential is if you have a lot of bushes around your tree and they produce a lot of suckers, it's hard to cut out the ones you don't want. So if you have a tree in a lawn, there's no issue. The suckers are easy to remove if you don't want them, or in an orchard setting, they're fine. Okay, so that's the Jujubes. Now the mulberries, I believe, are native throughout the northern hemisphere. So there are mulberries native to the U.S., but the mulberries that we generally eat the most are from Asia or Eurasia area. So the two species of mulberries, and mulberries are actually closely related to figs, and just as sturdy. They are very strong plants. So on mulberries, the two that we use the most for food is the black, also known as Persian. Botanically, it's Morus nigra, which means black, and then the white mulberry, which is Morus alba. Morus alba is from China, nigra is from the Persian area. Now both of them, usually we use the alba to feed silkworms. So at most elementary schools you'll see white mulberry trees. Now they come male and female, so only the females produce fruit. This is one case where you do not have to buy a male tree, because there are so many male mulberries in Southern California that throw pollen in the air, that any female is going to will be fertile. Don't have to worry about having a male tree nearby. So now the typical black mulberry tree grows around 25 feet. The typical white mulberry tree grows more like 40 to 50 foot. So it's a much bigger tree and faster growing too. So that's a pretty big difference. Now this is a black mulberry called Black Beauty. So it's a typical black mulberry. The fruit, which is forming underneath the leaves here, will get about that big on a mature tree. So a fairly good sized berry. It does taste like a blackberry, so it's got some acidity and sweetness that gives it a sweet and tart flavor. Very sweet though, and also very strongly flavored. And this Black Beauty also happens to be a dwarf tree, so it's only slated to grow about 15 foot. And since they only grow about 2 to 3 foot a year, you can keep it to a height you want to pick it at. So this tree was grafted on top of a white mulberry trunk about 4 feet off the ground. So when you plant this, this will drop down to about here, just because it's in a taller pot. And then you can reach most of the fruit here, and you can probably keep it cut so it's not too tall. These fruit ripen in early summer, and they turn red first and then black, and that's when you pick them, when they're black. Of course, they are a favorite bird food. But that's been a real popular and real strong flavored. Now this is a white black mulberry. So it's a black mulberry with white fruit. And it's pretty much ripe. You look at these, they were kind of a lime or a light greenish, pale green color. And now they're turning more or less a dirty gold color, and they're falling off. Very sweet. Whereas this one has got more of a sharper flavor. This is just sweet. Now the one advantage that the white version of the black mulberry has is, again, it doesn't get that tall. 25-foot max. It doesn't grow that fast. You can keep them cut. Whereas if you had a true white mulberry, they're speed burners, and it's hard to control the size. But this one is quite loaded. It's fairly new in this area of the world. We haven't had the white version of the black mulberry. The fruit on this is smaller than the regular black mulberries. In fact, among all the mulberries, the white versions seem to be a little smaller than the black ones. So anyway, this is the white Persian mulberry. Now on the white mulberry side, we don't carry just a standard white mulberry. We have in the past, but you know, they can grow 20 feet in 1 year. It's just crazy how fast they grow. Now this is one we do carry though. So this is a white mulberry called Pakistan. The fruit on this one is normally red. When you compare it to the black mulberries, when birds are eating them, and they eat them take them to your block wall and start eating them, or sit on your beautiful patio furniture and eat them, everything starts turning black. The red mulberries don't have any color. At least the juice doesn't, so it doesn't seem to stain anything. But anyway, this is Pakistan mulberry. When it's mature, now this is too young. We got these late last summer. They were about this big. So you can see it's growing fast. By winter, they were about this tall. And now this year, they put on about 3 foot so far. I do have some that are a little taller than this already. And by the end of this year, they could be well over 10 feet. So it is also very fast. Pakistan mulberry wants to be 30 by 30 at least. It is probably going to make fruit next year, a few, but when these get going, they make a lot of fruit. And the fruit is about that size and hangs down perhaps about at each joint of the leaf, maybe 4 or 5 of them, it seems. They make a lot of fruit. So they look like red worms hanging in the tree, actually. But they're very, very sweet. People do like this one a lot. And it's a very, very heavy producer when it's old enough. So maybe not next year, but the year after, it'll get into real heavy production. Now, mulberries do bear off of year-old wood. So what happens, so you can't cut them like you do a jujube, you have to leave some stem. So like on this particular plant, this branch is growing this year. If I cut it totally off, whatever grows out of this area next year won't have any fruit on. But you can just leave a little stub of this, and the branches that grow off of this will have berries on them. You have to leave a little bit of 1-year-old wood there. You can see on this particular tree here, which is older by a few years, that this branch grew last year. And now this branch growing off of that branch has fruit at the base of it. So the fruit, anything coming off of the oldest part won't have any fruit on it, but this came off of 1-year-old wood and it's got fruit on it. So you do have to save a little bit. So in other words, if this branch grows, say this branch grows 10 feet this year, you can cut off all but say 4 or 5 inches of that branch and you'll still have quite a bit of fruit. You can save even more of that and have a lot of fruit. If you, I mean, you don't have to cut it, then you have a lot of fruit that's really high up in the tree. So they do bear off of 1-year-old wood. Now, one of the fastest selling mulberries are the weeping ones. Unfortunately, this is a male weeper. So this is more for ornamental use, but most years we sell about 15 females that look just like this. They'll grow maybe 10 foot, and then they just arch over and hang down. A friend of ours up in the canyon has one that's about 12 years old or so, and it's about 10 foot, might be 10 foot tall. Underneath, you can stand inside of it and pick fruit from the inside. So it is a favorite for children's gardens. They actually have these, the non-fruiting version, in a lot of parks for kids, because in the summertime they can hide underneath the branches. It's just like a little teepee. In the wintertime, it's very unusual looking. So if you go to Disney World or even Disneyland, you'll see these with their distinctive branches that hang straight down in the winter. They're actually a little more exciting in the wintertime to look at. So this is a male, they call it chaparral, and the female version is T's Weeping. And this year we only got 5 and they sold real fast. And these are white mulberries too. They have black fruit. Now the one thing about mulberry that we found out by accident is that they can, so generally the leaves fall off in December. The white mulberries can wake up early. The white mulberries don't need much winter at all. Once the leaves are off, this first sign of warmth, they'll just grow back. They don't need winter for anything else but to drop the leaves. So these, generally, when they first start growing, they always bloom first. That is when they have enough energy. They bloom, the fruit ripens in 3 or 4 months from the time they bloom, or even a little faster than that, 2 or 3 months from the time they bloom. These black mulberries usually wake up a little later. They need a little warmer to wake up, and then they fruit in early summer. But what we found out is if you knock all the leaves off a branch, the branch wants to re-leaf. But if it's a fairly mature branch, it blooms again. So we've gotten one branch on, especially in the Pakistan mulberry. I've grown this in my own yard. You can strip after the fruit's off in late spring, you can strip all the leaves off a branch, and that branch will then flower again and fruit again. And it'll do it 2 or 3 times in 1 year. Now we tried it on young trees, doesn't work. You have to have a real strong, mature tree. These would probably do it this year. Because what happened, the way we found this out is that a customer bought a weeping mulberry, just like this, but a female form. Didn't like the fruit. I mean, everybody thinks the fruit's excellent, it's just small, but they didn't like the fruit, so they pulled it out of the ground and brought it back to us. We stuck it in a pot, but the shock of pulling it on the ground dropped its foliage, so it sat there for a few weeks looking dead, and then it rebloomed, and then made another set of leaves and fruit. So he said, okay, that's interesting. Just the fact that it had no leaves and it was warm induced it to grow, but to grow it had to flower first. So we did our Pakistan mulberry at least 3 times in one branch. Same branch, fruiting over and over and over. Our growing season's long enough, so you can even get a fall crop on these. So no need for winter. The only purpose for winter on mulberries seems to make them drop their foliage so that they can bloom with the next heat wave. Any questions on mulberries? So white mulberries get big unless they're the weeping ones. There are white mulberries that make white fruit, of course, red fruit and black fruit, and apparently the same with black mulberries. It's just the name they have, but they can make fruit of all colors. Now, mulberries, like figs, root system is fairly invasive. That doesn't mean that they lift things up. I haven't really seen them lift things up, but that means that within, say, 5 feet of the trunk, it's almost solid root in the ground. It's real hard to dig holes around a mature tree. So plan ahead if you're growing, especially if you're growing like the Pakistan mulberry. If you want to put bushes around it, plant it as you plant the tree. Don't try to dig in there later and plant something because it's going to be solid root. When I was a kid, one of my neighbors had a regular white mulberry with the small white fruit, and that was their favorite climbing tree. So they get big enough to do that in. Okay, any questions on the mulberries? We've seen a dwarf mulberry, and in fact last year we sold a dwarf mulberry that was called Everbearing. Decided not to bring it in this year. The fruit is only about that big, so it's fairly small fruit, and you can make these bear over and over with, I think, better fruit. We've done the black mulberries too, stripped the leaves and got a second crop on those too, and that's, to us, that's better fruit than the small mulberry. So.
Maybe a question, sorry to raise it since I just
Mm-hmm.
put it in. I'm silly enough to actually have a black mulberry in a pot. I mean, how stupid is that, or is that a viable way of keeping it at least alive?
No, they're pretty good in pots. Okay. Yeah, I had a Pakistan mulberry in a pot for a long time. Thing would still grow really fast, but that kept under control better. So. Most trees are good for about 10 years in pots before they get root bound and not very productive. Yeah. We do have a good number of the Pakistan mulberries in stock. Most of these other mulberry trees only have two or three of each. Jujubes, I have quite a few of the lees out there and the Shanxi lees. Persimmon is what we're short on this year. So in southern or eastern Asia and Japan, that's where persimmons are from, although there are persimmons native to the United States. But in Japan, they are certainly a lot of folk tales about you can't stop eating persimmons once you start. So they have folk tales about animals exploding because they can't stop eating the fruit. So it is considered one of the most best, favorite fruits especially in Japan. So now there are two types of persimmons, just so you know. The ones that are astringent until ripe, and the non-astringent ones. Now, if you've ever had an astringent wine, drinking it makes it kind of cleans. Instead of your mouth being, say, slimy, it's now totally non-slimy. If you can figure out what that means, but the Hachia persimmon which was the original persimmon grown in California. I don't know. It's interesting. Back in the 1930s and 40s. The farmers in the Central Valley were introduced to the Hachia persimmon. Trees incredibly productive, huge fruit. When it's jelly ripe, it's wonderful, but when it's not ripe, it is incredibly astringent. And what that means, if you've never tried one, you'll have, you can buy these at the store in the fall and try it. But the juice, it looks like a ripe tomato. It's about the texture of a ripe tomato. And you take a bite and it's juicy, but your mouth is totally dry. You cannot swallow, you can't talk. It's an incredible sensation to be that astringent. So after that, most people never want to try a persimmon again. Well, even Japan, this is not the favorite persimmon for fresh eating. But if you do let it ripen until it's almost like jelly, then it's fine. The astringency goes away. But the ones that most people prefer are the non-astringent ones, which are shaped more like a tomato. So the non-astringent ones shape more like this. They're kind of flat rather than shaped like a cone. And you can eat them crispy like an apple, and there's no astringency. They do have a somewhat of a cinnamon flavor. Cinnamon, you can say a little bit of chocolatey to them, but more a cinnamon flavor. Very fall tasting, like Thanksgiving flavors. So that, and the trees are very, very productive. Now the persimmon trees are also a little difficult for the growers to propagate, so they are quite expensive bare root trees. Um, this is the fuyu type, the one that you can eat firm. This was the last good one I had this year, so I've got about a half dozen real small trees in small pots, but the stems on them are no thicker than this branch. And to me, that may not be worth selling this year. So as far as the fuyu persimmons goes, in this case, it might be worth waiting till next year's bare root crop, because the bare root trees came in this big. And this is already flowering and it's making fruit. The fruit is seedless and it ripens in late September or October. They're not real fast growing trees, and they usually, when they get into heavy production, it's really heavy. The first persimmon tree I ever grew back in the 1980s, the first year was this tall, had 2 fruit. Second year, this tall, had 25. By the third year, it had 75 fruit, and the branches were just hanging. They just couldn't get anywhere, but it just kept producing. Every year, it produced more than it should have, so it couldn't grow. But I wasn't about to take any of that fruit off. I love persimmons. Fortunately, I had 2 trees, so the other one spent its first 3 years growing, and then when it's had its first crop, it had about 150. So they are quite productive trees. The original fuyu, so when I was a kid, the original fuyu persimmon was shaped about like this, and usually had 3 or 4 seeds in the middle. So the modern fuyu persimmons are not really fuyus. This is actually called Jiro, Jiro, and that is the most popular persimmon being grown in California. It is seedless, totally seedless. Even though the original one had a little bit of brown in it, which gave it a little bit more of a different flavor, I do like the modern persimmons better without the seeds, and they're bigger fruit. We also, now Jiro usually ripens October. There is another one that we bring in called Emoto, and all Emoto is a sport off of Jiro. So what that means is, what happened was, a farmer who has an orchard full of Jiro persimmons one year found that the branches on one of his trees consistently produced 2 weeks earlier than the rest of the orchard. Woke up earlier, fruit ripened a couple weeks earlier, so he cut it off and called it Emoto after himself. I think that was whose orchard it was. And so the Emoto persimmon ripens a little earlier than Juro, so it kind of stretches your harvest a little bit. Now, not knowing this, my dad and I used to have taste tests. We'd pick fruit off for Juro and pick fruit off for Emoto and eat them both at the same time and said, well, we like the Emoto better. Well, it turns out it's the same plant, it's just the Emoto's 2 weeks riper. So it was always better when you compared them side by side. But if you let the Juro ripen a little bit for 2 weeks, it'd probably taste the same as the Emoto. So those two are quite similar. There is another one that's also non-astringent called Izu, and we have a lot of people asking for Izu. Now, the book says Izu tastes better than Juro or Emoto. There's no way to confirm that because Izu ripens way earlier. In my own yard, Izu ripened in August, like a month and a half before Juro and 2 months before Emoto. So there's no way you can do a taste test. Perhaps if you can save it that long, it would be way riper and maybe sweeter than the rest. But Izu, if you want something, if you want to start eating persimmons in August, you get Izu. Now the other persimmons that are out there that are also fairly popular, this is the one called Chocolate. And the fruit on it are shaped like an astringent hachia, a little bit smaller fruit, not quite as big, but still good size. And this one has seeds, and around the seeds the flesh is very brown, and it does definitely have a somewhat mild chocolate flavor to it. So a lot of people like this one. The interesting thing about it is it has both male and female flowers. The male flowers are the small ones, the female flowers are the larger ones, and it needs to pollinate itself to make the seeds. Now the original Fuyu made a few male flowers too. The Juro and the Emoto don't make any male flowers at all. All you see are the female flowers. They make fruit without the males around. There is another persimmon out there. So we have the Chocolate, and we also sell in the wintertime, we sold out already this year, Coffee Cake. So Coffee Cake is not quite as dark. I don't know, the book says it's swirls of chocolate and orange. So it's a little interesting. Now the problem with Coffee Cake is that if you don't have the chocolate nearby, there's no way the fruit's edible. I thought, I had a Coffee Cake at my house, and I had a Emoto and a Juro nearby, and I thought, well, I think they'll make some male flowers to pollinate the Coffee Cake. Well, they never made any male flowers, but the Coffee Cake still made fruit. I mean, beautiful, slightly rounded, big fruit, kind of a dull orange color, and I thought, well, maybe they'll taste okay, but there was no way I can make them edible. It was just strange. Without the seeds inside, without any male flowers around, my tree made like 200 fruit. They were this big, absolutely gorgeous, totally inedible. They would never, I don't know, I tried all the tricks we do with the hachias. One trick you do to the hachia to make it edible is throw it in the freezer a couple times, freeze it, thaw, and then it becomes non-astringent. Another way is to put it in a bag full with a few drops of alcohol, and it becomes non-astringent. Nothing worked on the Coffee Cake at all. It was just like rubber. Would not become edible. So that one definitely needs to have a chocolate next to it with the male flowers to get fruit. Now persimmons, among these trees, persimmons need the best drainage. They don't like to sit in standing water, although if the soil is sandy, the water doesn't seem to hurt them. So it's not the water that's causing the problem. It's the roots need to breathe air better than the other trees. Like it's hard to hurt a mulberry for any reason at all, but persimmons, I don't trust any other growers because most growers try to grow it in ground up wood and the trees never look good. The color is always off. It's always kind of a lighter green with a lot of yellow and red leaves mixed in because the root system does not like compost in it. So you have to be very careful where you get persimmons from. Bare root in January is the best way to buy them. One other reason is because I've got to cut off half the roots to get them in pots. Usually when we get a persimmon tree, the roots are massive, and we have to cut them a lot to pot them up. But they are quite heavy producers, quite very reliable. Any questions on the persimmons? Don't have to do much. If you want to keep them small, they do produce off of your old growth. So this branch here, if you don't trim it too much next year, then the branches coming off it will have flowers on them and you'll have plenty of fruit. So the only thing we do on trees like this to keep them productive and not get too big. So the theme really is we want them to make fruit but not get too big. Well, if they continue growing every year, they got plenty of new growth. If you try to keep them the same size every year, it's hard because you have to cut off the new growth to keep them the same size. So one of the tricks we have to do on these is to keep them the same size but still have room for new growth is when the branching gets too dense, thin out some branches in the winter. So this one isn't too dense yet, but say if you had a lot of branches here, you cut off, get rid of half the branches so that new branches can grow in the same area. So they don't have to get bigger, they can just grow new stuff right in here. So that's one of the things we do is thin out the branching so they have plenty of room inside the tree to grow new wood for next year's crop.
So when you're cutting it, you cut it at the very base of it?
Yes, if you have a lot of branches that you don't need, just
Right at the base?
right, so they don't regrow. So they'll grow from these side branches into that area. Well, if you cut them short, let them regrow in the same area, that could work too. So you don't have to cut them off. You can just cut them short and then they'll regrow a new branch here and then that'll fruit the following year. So that's the strategy. You got to thin them out to keep them productive at this size. Otherwise, they've got to grow a little bigger every year to stay productive, but you may not want them to get bigger. You may not want 500 persimmons. And I have one of my friends has the original persimmon tree with the seeds in a farm orchard in Tustin. One tree must have produced, had to be close to 1,000 fruit. She cut the tree in half this winter after the crop was off. It was so big. It's like 30 foot tall, 30 foot wide, at least 1,000 fruit every year. It's just crazy. So she severely cut it this year. It's still making crop this year, but that is an amazing fruit tree with that when they can do that. And we've seen hot chia persimmons in Orange and Santa Ana, easily 1,000 fruit.
So
And
the fall is the best to trim them?
Pardon?
The fall is the best to trim?
Winter,
Winter, okay.
when the fruit's off. So this one's already sold, unfortunately. So the only trees I have, again, I have some really tiny trees, but on the Fuyu persimmons, I'd recommend waiting because the little trees I have now will not look like this next year. They're just too young. One last note. So all these trees, about the only bug there's not many bugs that eat these at all. Nothing seems to eat the leaves. Occasionally you might get a grasshopper eating a leaf or so, but we just have not had much trouble with them. There's no silkworms out there in nature to eat the mulberry leaves, but now and then we'll get scale and mealybugs and whitefly. Whitefly on the mulberries, scale and mealybugs on the persimmon, actually on the fruit itself sometimes. And so if we get that, to treat them organically, hit them with an oil spray. So this is just oil. It covers the whitefly or the scale or mealybug with a fine layer of oil for a few hours. They can't breathe. They die. The oil evaporates. The tree is clean after that. You can spray it almost any time of the year. those bugs are usually promoted by ants. The ants bring them to your trees. So we do recommend controlling ants in the garden. Amdro is the best ant product we've seen. It's not organic, but you don't have to put it underneath your tree. If you put this in your neighbor's yard, the ants will still find it, still kill all the ants in your yard. You can throw it in the green belt or on the driveway. The ants, it's ant food, cornmeal and a vegetable oil with a slow-acting poison in it, so they just carry it back to their nest. Everybody in the colony can eat it for a couple days, and they all drop dead on the third day. And a lot of our customers said no ants for years in our neighborhood. Seems to do a real good job cleaning out the neighborhood. Yeah, but it's safer than a lot of the ants are. So one of our customers who has a dog called up the company to find out how much of this could kill his dog. So he told him his dog is about 30 pounds. They told him he would have to eat 2 pounds of this to kill him. 2 pounds will cover over an acre. So if the dog would have to eat a whole bunch of dirt to get enough of this to, probably the dirt will kill the dog, not the poison. So this is used a lot, on playgrounds to get rid of the ants, because the ants, like fire ants, are far more dangerous to people than this product. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.